Hello, and welcome to the second of our special episodes of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend, and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hi, Ray.
Well, the first thing to say is what happened to the normal intro music?
I thought we'd change it just for once to acknowledge the subject matter for our special episode, Ray.
Well, not everyone who's listening is going to love classical music, Graham, so do you want to explain what you mean by that?
Well, of course, that was the Troika from Prokofiev's Lieutenant Kijé suite.
A troika, you say? A not so subtle nod in the direction of the big story of the week, I guess, rather than us messing about on sleighs.
It is, and I was pretty certain you'd recognise that piece, so I'm going to put my money on you knowing what a troika is as well.
Graham, it's a traditional Russian three-horse sled.
Okay, well, there you go. I was right. And, well, that brings to an end the cultural hors d'oeuvres of the podcast. Let's move on to the meat of the main course.
Teftelli.
I'm sorry?
Russian meatballs, Graham.
Also appropriate, Ray. I think there may well be a few Russian meatballs. I think we've got a large serving coming up, in fact.
Well, I thought we would, which is why I did a bit of Russian homework this week.
Excellent. And what else did you learn from your homework, Ray?
Well, Troika is big. There must be a lot more stories still to come.
And why'd you say that?
Because according to the OCCRP, the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, who masterminded the collection, organisation and initial release of these stories, they've gathered together 1.3 million bank transactions totalling $470 billion and involving over 230,000 legal entities.
They are truly astonishing numbers. So, should we take a minute or two to look at them in a bit more detail?
Yeah, why don't we? But before we do you want to explain your own role, Graham, in Troika?
Okay, it's not a huge one, as I don't personally have access to that database. Shame. But a couple of the journalists who do asked me to look over some of the paperwork to help them understand what was going on and where they might want to concentrate.
Can you say any more than that?
Well, not really. I mean, one of the investigations is still ongoing, and the other one was published, at least in part, by my good friends at Berlingske, the Danish paper that broke the Danske story. Now, that one was mainly centred on the Nordea branch in Vesterport in Copenhagen, where a significant number of payments were received.
Just one of many stories this week.
Yeah, but before we go into those in any more detail, shall we go back to that headline figure? What do you make of that, Ray?
Well, as we just said, they're astonishing figures, but I think before we go any further, we ought to at least try and put them into some context.
Okay, so why don't you start?
Okay, I will. So, firstly, one of the big things we know about laundromats and have repeatedly referred to in these podcasts is what you spoke about in an article earlier this week as the rinse. Now, that's the part where money is circulated repeatedly around the laundromat accounts, and there are hundreds, possibly thousands of them, constantly mixing them together until it's almost impossible to tell specifically which bit came from which source.
And what impact does that have, Ray?
Well, it means that those figures we quoted will be counting the same money multiple times across multiple transactions. So the 1.3 million transactions valued at $470 billion will contain an awful lot of double counting.
Yes, you're right. B&H in the Danske Bank report went to an awful lot of trouble to point out that they had discounted intra-branch flows. But of course, what they couldn't do is discount money that left the branch completely, only to return from a different source. So even the $230 billion of Danske money will inevitably contain some multiple counting.
Exactly, and bear in mind that double counting does have some curious effects in the real economy, and that may be something that we come back to and when we talk about the credit creation multiplier and artificially inflating the money supply and all of that geeky stuff. But that's not for today, Graham.
Okie doke.
I think we can assume that the legal entity figures are accurate, but here again, a lot of these will be innocent parties who are simply named in the accounts or were at the end of the chain of payments. And I don't think they could have known that they were recipients necessarily of potentially dark money.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right again, Ray. Does it matter?
Well, I think it does. I'm not suggesting in any way that anyone has set out to mislead, simply that accurately reporting the headline figures needs a bit of interpreting for those who don't have a deep understanding of how laundromats work.
Which is one of the fundamental purposes, of course, of this podcast.
Well, quite.
So what else would you draw from those headline figures?
Even allowing for multiple counting, we're still talking about huge sums of money and a multiplicity of transactions with a massive number of entities, a very significant number of which will be shell companies set up solely to receive and transmit dark money. So I think it's highly likely that pretty much every bank in Europe and beyond will have touched some of this money at some point.
So they're all in trouble.
Well, I think that would be a harsh judgment. There will be many right at the end of the chain of transactions for whom it would be incredibly difficult to understand the ultimate source of the funds. So I don't think they should be lumped in with some who appear to have been more centrally involved.
Yes, I think there are probably some defining characteristics of banks which currently do carry some jeopardy.
What would be your main points to look for here?
I'd say values and volumes, Ray. If a bank has received a large number of high-value transactions over a period of time, then I think it's fair to say they should have realised sooner.
Or just realised.
Well, yeah, exactly. The depressing part of what's happened this week is the number of banks who have either consistently denied any wrongdoing or who constantly blame it on past practices as if what they're doing today is just all fine.
And isn't it?
Well, it's a hard question to answer, but I do know from conversations with many journalists that these laundromats are having something of a domino effect, and there are further leaks in the works which are much more current. It would indicate the problem is not simply one from the past.
That's very interesting. But I guess that's all you can say for the time being.
Yeah, I can say with certainty that Troika will not be the last laundromat we'll be hearing about this year, though.
But for the time being, let's stick with Troika. It would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall in the boardrooms of some of our banks this week, wouldn't it?
Yes, you'd have to say that one or two made a few poor calls this week. The boss at Swedbank gave a press conference that has rather backfired. She appeared to think the bank hadn't got a problem with money laundering, despite a TV documentary which has not been refuted, claiming that the bank had handled more than $4 billion over a period of about 8 years.
Yes, I saw that. And then there's RBS saying that any problem identified at ABN AMRO, which has also been in the news, stemmed from a time when it might not have owned the bank, and anyway it's since been shut down.
Yeah, that's not the most robust of replies, is it? I can't help thinking that something along the lines of, well, although this happened a long time ago, we will do everything we can to find out whether we could have done more at the time, or if there are things we can learn that will help us in the future.
It hasn't exactly been a PR triumph all round, has it?
No. You can only hope that the really clever banks are currently hard at work doing exactly that, though, looking back at historic activity, even if it is through the lens of current knowledge, because that can both help them to identify any contemporaneous activity which bears the same fingerprints and help to inform future policies and systems to stop it from happening again.
Do the banks themselves have access to the OCCRP data? Are they checking their own exposure?
Well, I don't think they need access to the data, do they, Ray? After all, it's the bank's data that the OCP have used to detect the Troika Laundromat.
Yeah, true. And that raises an important point as well, doesn't it? Why have the banks themselves not joined the dots? Why does it take hackers and investigative journalists to piece it all together when the banks have had the data all the time? And, for that matter, the actual responsibility for doing it.
Well, yes, and the other thing that's really just occurred to me is that data comes from people working in the banks. So it does tend to suggest that the banks are not listening to their own people or are not giving them the opportunity to call out that problem.
Yeah. So why not?
Tone from the top, Ray?
And of course there are IT issues as well, aren't there?
Yes, the bank's IT systems just aren't always great at interrogating this data or spotting anomalies. Banks have invested a lot of time and money trying to make them better, but of course this doesn't contribute at all to their main objectives, which is looking after clients and making profits. So spending on these systems has tended to be really tightly controlled.
And maybe, Graham, the focus has been too much on the pattern of transactional activity and not on the nature of the underlying entities. We've shown time and time again throughout these podcasts that many of these laundromat entities bear hallmarks which aren't too hard to spot.
Oh, Ray, I just agree with you so much. And of course, one of the great advantages here in the UK of having a transparent register like Companies House is that you can monitor the formation of new companies and look for anomalies or unusual elements.
Can you give us an example, Graham?
Yes. Now, how about one from yesterday?
Wow, you've been working hard.
Ray, I've got a bit of free time at the moment, so I thought I'd try and use it wisely.
Well, go on then.
Just to be clear, though, I'm not suggesting anything I'm about to say suggests impropriety, just that the information was anomalous.
Agreed. Facts are fine, opinions are out.
Yes. So, yesterday, 9th of March 2019, a brand new Limited Liability Partnership, or LLP, was created. It's registered to an address in Percy Street in what's known as Fitzrovia in central London. It has, as is required by law, 2 designated members. Now, I won't name them, but they are both Seychellois.
And somebody's working on their behalf at a weekend. Great.
Yeah.
So, to be clear, they're residents of the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. And actually, also the same day, a limited company was formed with one of those same residents of the Seychelles named as sole director and shareholder. And there were 4 more in February and 4 in January and so on, all with that same one person. In fact, that one person is or has been a director or partner to more than 100 UK entities, along with, having checked on Open Corporates, other entities in Cyprus, Panama, Ireland and Czechia, or what's used to be known as the Czech Republic.
And possibly others, because Open Corporates, regrettably, can't give us data from every jurisdiction at the moment.
Spot on.
That's an interesting list, nonetheless.
Yes, and the weird thing is that I can't find any information about either of these people except their details on company registers.
But you'd think that someone who is a director or partner in hundreds of companies would have some sort of internet presence, wouldn't you?
Yes, you would, Ray. I couldn't even find a Facebook page, frankly, so it was, they're just not there. I did, however, find one of them on a whole bunch of legal paperwork for an Irish limited partnership.
Ooh, and what were those papers all about?
Well, there was a power of attorney, there was a declaration of trust, and there were some nominee forms.
So this person from the Seychelles was acting as a nominee for someone else?
Yes, a Russian gentleman. I won't name him either, but he's operating an online trading platform offering, quote, investment with real interest from 48% to 120% per annum.
Ooh. Now, I've got to say, Graham, in the current climate, that doesn't sound altogether plausible.
No, and unhelpfully, the telephone number given on the website is 123456789, which just might not be their real number.
You're very suspicious-minded, Graham. But anyway, none of that sounds terribly good. What can we learn from this?
Well, all of that came from me just monitoring one newly formed LLP, which has 2 partners from the Seychelles, but it's registered in London. So that just is a red flag for me. Now, that led me to the fact that these 2 people were involved in a large number of businesses in a lot of different countries, another red flag, many of which are associated with laundromat activity, another red flag. And for those few companies I've looked at more closely, I have always managed to discover either a Russian or other Central or Eastern European connections, which is another red flag. Just to be clear, none of those are specifically indicative of criminal activity. They are just increasing the risks.
No, that's true, but once again, we have this accumulation of red flags. Offshore company officers, UK registration, ownership apparently in Central or Eastern Europe, and presumably they've opened a bank account somewhere.
Exactly. Our Russian chap offering his online investment platform needs somewhere to bank his money. There has to be an account, and some bank somewhere should have done KYC on that account opening.
But probably not one of the big well-known banks.
No, but that's where the switch from monitoring transactions to monitoring the underlying entities could become important.
So if I read you correctly, Graham, these small banks will at some point need to use a correspondent bank to move these funds into the mainstream financial system. And if these correspondents started building a watch list of entities, names and addresses which have these red flags, they could identify potential laundromat activity without relying on specific transactional typologies and before it really gets started.
Yes, and that, I'm going to suggest, is our Dark Money Files thesis, Ray.
Well, I think it's got a lot going for it. Shall I just summarise where I think we've got to so far?
Yes, please do.
OK, the release of the latest OCCRP data, known as the Troika Laundromat, has once again shocked us with the sheer scale of the sums involved. And of course, it's right and proper that past wrongdoing is brought to light and acted on accordingly. But if there is to be long-term value from these leaks, the banks have to start looking at the underlying patterns of behaviour and learning better ways of dealing with them in future.
I am in 100% agreement so far.
And what you've shown is that with the right systems or people monitoring the formation of new companies, where the country has a transparent register, that information can rapidly lead you to other potentially suspicious entities, which could enable you to proactively identify financial crime in real time and report it accordingly.
And that's exactly right. We have to accept that this is not the only typology, nor indeed the only form of money laundering, but it is one of the biggest, and because of that it has to have these underlying connections, which are both its strength and its weakness.
And we ought to say, for the benefit of any bankers listening who find this interesting and would like to consider taking this approach further, we do other things than podcasting, Graham.
We do. We both passionately want to help banks throughout the world fight this menace, and we'd be just delighted to have private conversations with any bank who'd like to explore that approach further.
And if they want to get in touch?
Email thedarkmoneyfiles@gmail.com. It's that easy.
Right. So, that's Global Laundromat sorted. What's happening next week?
I think next week we're going to return to the B&H report on Danske Bank and look at what happens if you don't have robust systems and controls in place within your global branch network.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dark Money Files. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.